Let me welcome you all to this commemorative event that will mark 50 years of the setting up of the WCC's program on interreligious dialogue and cooperation. We are gathered here as faithful witnesses to history and hopeful pilgrims into the future. On this occasion, may I invite the Acting General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, the Reverend Professor Yon Soka, to formally welcome us and offer the opening remarks. Father Soka.
Thank you, Peniel. Eminences, Excellencies, distinguished guests and friends. It is a joy for me to welcome each one of you to this celebratory event. Today, we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the setting up of the WCC's Office of Interreligious Dialogue and Cooperation. It is truly an occasion where we can revisit the past with gratitude to God and envision the future in a spirit of hope, trusting in God's faithfulness. The setting up of the WCC subunit on dialogue with people of living faiths and ideologies at the meeting of the WCC Central Committee held in Addis Ababa in 1971 was an affirmation that the World Council of Churches understood dialogue as an important means of Christian presence and participation in a multi-religious world. Over the years, we have come to understand the call to dialogue as a call to be servants of Christ and stewards of God's mysteries, to use the word of St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, 1-2. Since its setting up, the journey of the dialogue program of the World Council of Churches has been an adventure of witness and service. This adventure of faith has continued over the past 50 years as the WCC embarked on a search for fresh self-understanding, new questions, and better expressions of our Christian faith and commitment in a multi-religious world. Alongside this, we have sought to sincerely embrace both the challenge of religious plurality and the praxis of interreligious dialogue. The last 50 years bear rich testimony to the development of the WCC's commitment and engagement in interreligious relationships. From inviting interreligious guests to East Assembly in Nairobi in 1975, to our thriving interreligious relationships today with Buddhists, Hindus, Jews, Muslims, and Sikhs, God has enabled us to make encouraging strides. We are particularly grateful to our interreligious and ecumenical partners for their support and solidarity. Our relationship with the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue has enabled both offices to foster interreligious dialogue ecumenically and has resulted in many fruits, including the latest joint text on, I quote, serving a wounded world in interreligious solidarity. The recently formed network of interfaith advisors is hoped to be an important means for the fellowship of churches to actively pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding in a multi-religious world. as I reflect today's event, I am reminded of a Sudanese proverb which says, "Two things we desire to bequeath to our children. The first one is roots. The other one is wings." This event will help us focus on both roots and wings. The program on interreligious dialogue had strong roots, both historical and theological. The last 50 years provide a strong legacy to build further upon. At the same time, we are also called to embrace the gift of freedom, the gift of wings, that can help us imagine fresh and fruitful ways to bear witness in a pluralistic world in creative fidelity to the gospel of Christ. Let me congratulate the 5 winners of the recent essay competition on the future of interreligious dialogue. Lea Schlenker, sorry if I don't pronounce well the names, but you may identify yourself. Christno Sapteno, Ioannis Christodoulakis, Nicole Carlson, and Christopher West. Warm congratulations to you. They will help us to reflect on the future of interreligious dialogue. They will present their visions for the future and engage in conversation with our beloved colleagues, the Reverend Professor Wesley Ariaraja and Dr. Claire Amos, former staff members of the dialogue program of the All Cast of Churches. I feel that in this intergenerational conversation, we can focus on the future without losing our sight of the past, and embrace the past, present, and the future with humility, confidence, and hope. In conclusion, let me remind us that for Christians, interreligious solidarity is a way both of living out Jesus Christ's commandment to love the neighbor and also of working with the neighbor to seek peace, which is God's will for the world. May our meeting today enable us to discern and discover new ways to open our hearts in dialogue and our hands in solidarity, so that we can, together with our neighbors, build a world marked by healing and hope. May God bless us.
Thank you, Professor Soka, for these opening remarks, and especially for reminding us through the Sudanese proverb of the importance of the legacy of roots and wings. As an event which seeks to reminisce the past and rethink the future, this event is about embracing both the gift of roots and of wings. So let us now turn to our roots, the history of the Interreligious Dialogue Program of the WCC. To help reflect on our roots, we are grateful to have with us today 2 former staff members of the WCC's Office of Interreligious Dialogue and Cooperation. They will help us to reflect on the past and enable us to understand how the WCC, over the past 50 years, has moved beyond various stumbling blocks and learned to build interreligious dialogue and relations founded firmly on the gift of plurality, which some have pointed out as being the cornerstone of God's universal design. First, let me invite Professor Wesley Raja, the former Deputy General Secretary of the WCC and Director of the Dialogue Program, to share his thoughts. Dr. Raja.
Yeah. First, I want to say, as a second director of the new subunit on dialogue with people and living faiths, and it was a great joy to be part of a celebration of the 50th anniversary of that event. Father Sauka rightly pointed out that the subunit was created in 1971. But the history of interfaith dialogue and the struggle for the birth of the subunit goes far beyond that time, from almost the first World Missionary Conference in 1910. From 1910 World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, there had been a very intense debate on how should Christians evaluate other religious traditions, relate to people other religious traditions, and how they can witness to other religious traditions. And there had been an enormous struggle through all the World Missionary Conferences then, at Edinburgh, then at Jerusalem, then at Canberra, and there was a very big battle among the Christians on how we should relate to people of other religious traditions. Whether it is mission or whether we should change from direct mission to convert people to a new way of relating to others. It is out of this struggle that finally, in the Nairobi Assembly, there was a major crisis for the dialogue program to ask whether the dialogue program should even continue. Because is it a denial of the uniqueness of Christ? Is it a denial of mission? Is it related to syncretism, relativism? Therefore, there was a major conference was called in Chiang Mai in 1978, and guidelines on dialogue was created. So the first major landmark in the past history of dialogue program is that out of a long struggle, finally we produced what we call the guidelines on dialogue with people and living faiths. This document is a foundational document for the interfaith dialogue program. So first part of the history is a struggle within the church, within Christians, on how to relate to people of other religious traditions. Once that was established, we moved to the second phase of actually creating occasions for relate to people of other religious traditions. This is where the number of multilateral, bilateral, trilateral dialogue programs that have been done by the World Council of Churches with all the major religious traditions came in the second phase. It is not easy because we have very bad history with Judaism, very bad history with Hinduism, with Islam, and there are grave misunderstanding about Christians among Hindus and Buddhists and others because of the missionary movement. Therefore, creating a new community of conversation, creating a dialogue partners, having a possibility to engage with people of other religious traditions. It was a long process, but that was a second major emphasis in the history of the dialogue department. As a result, we had a number of bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral dialogues, most of it are documented. But once that came into being, we had major questions. How do we theologically understand the reality of other religious traditions? What is the basis for our relationship? Do we believe that God is listening to the prayer of a Hindu? Do we say that the religious life of a Jew is still valid? How do we understand people of other religious traditions? What is the theological basis on which we enter into religious tradition? Does God relate to others? Or does God relate only to those who accept Jesus Christ? Therefore, the third phase in the history was an exploration of the theological understanding of people of other religious traditions and theological self-understanding that enables us to enter into a genuine and open dialogue with people of other religious traditions. This search for an appropriate theology of religions culminated in two documents. One is called the Bar 1, other is Bar 2, because they took place in an important, in a place called Bar near Zurich. Therefore, three stages in the history. First, an internal struggle within the church to come to understand, accept, and to codify what dialogue is. And the second is the actual attempt to relate to people of other faiths through numerous interfaith dialogue and multilateral dialogues, locally, nationally, and internationally. And thirdly, a struggle within the life of the church to find a theological basis and an understanding of other religious traditions, to re-understand ourselves in order to be able to in dialogue. It is on this basis that we now look forward to how we relate to people of other faiths as we look to the future.
Thank you, Professor Ariraja, for taking us on this journey into the past. To help us to reflect further on what the journey entailed, let me invite my former colleague, Dr. Claire Amos, the previous coordinator of the Interreligious Dialogue Program of the WCC. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Peniel. I'm honoured to be here this afternoon, and it's been very good to listen to Wesley briefly sharing the process of the story of interreligious dialogue in the World Council of Churches. Arriving at the World Council 10 years ago, about a decade after Wesley left, I was a fortunate heir to those developments, and his words resonate with my understanding of our role. Strange though it may seem today, once upon a time, before these days of COVID, the WCC and the Ecumenical Centre regularly used to receive visitors from around the world, groups of Christians who happened to be in Geneva and wanted to see for themselves this special place at the heartbeat of the ecumenical movement. Hopefully, one day, soon, it will be possible for such groups to visit once again. But it was gratifying that when asked by the visitors officer what areas of work these visitors would like to hear about, most of them made clear that interreligious dialogue was one of their concerns. So Peniel and I, Peniel and I regularly found ourselves speaking to such people and trying to offer a coherent vision of what we're aiming to achieve in the interreligious office. To help the process, I devised a one-page chart of our vision and goals, which got slightly updated each year to take account of new developments. And I fished out of my computer files the version of the chart that we used in 2017. As you can see, it has 3 columns with an overall heading which states our work has 3 interlinked aspects to it. The column on the left says, we seek to resource and enable our fellow Christians to live and minister in our multi-religious world. One of the things that I tried to make clear to our visitors was that the primary target group of the World Council of Churches interreligious work was not in fact representatives of other faiths, but our fellow Christians. We needed to help them understand that serious engagement by Christians with people of other religions did not undermine our own Christian faith, but rather was a vital expression of it. Among other aspects, this led us towards exploration of key aspects of Christian theology. I thought then, as I still believe today, that people engaging in interreligious dialogue need to be embedded in the center of their own faith traditions rather than being viewed as on the periphery. And it was important that we reflected that in the work of the office. The column in the middle says, we seek to develop and sustain long-term bilateral relationships with partners representing other faiths and with organizations which are intentionally interreligious. And I think this is a point where interreligious engagement is a sort of expression of diplomacy, of enabling or participating in formal meetings, ideally on a regular basis, with genuine and recognized representatives of other religious traditions. In the case of the World Council of Churches, some of these bilateral relationships go back a very long way. As regards those that have existed without a break, probably our longest relationship, a longest lasting relationship, has been with the Center for Interreligious Dialogue in Tehran. And I'm grateful to our Shia friends who received us with kindness and hospitality in Iran, and for being willing to accept our hospitality in return. Perhaps it's worth just mentioning at this point the Ecumenical Institute at Bosse, how it is a jewel in the World Council of Churches crown, which glows with a particular intensity as a location to offer warm and gracious hospitality, enabling the WCC to be at home to our interreligious guests. And the column on the right suggests, we seek to work with partners of other faiths on matters of mutual concern, particularly relating to issues of justice and peace. And that certainly, most certainly, is a major reason for the work that the World Council of Churches does under the first and the second heading, to enable us to work together in this way, in this third way. But, and this is key, I think, working together with representatives of other religions on issues such as ecology, peace building, the role of women, does not mean that we can leave columns 1 and 2 completely behind. Been there, done that. No, that's not right. We need to continue to work hard in these areas as well, or we will find that they unexpectedly rise up to bite us. As Wesley and I have both suggested, although we've been using a slightly different language, all 3 areas have been part of the past and the present of the interreligious work of the World Council of Churches. And I believe that all 3 areas also need to be part of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for leading us further in this journey. I think between you and Wesley, you have covered both the roots, R-O-O-T-S, as well as the many roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, of the WCC's history of interreligious engagement. 50 years in 12 minutes. So from this focus on the roots, we now turn to the wings. Those wings that will hopefully carry us with courage and confidence to new ways of interreligious engagement. And to do this, we are especially delighted to welcome today the 5 young theologians who successfully took part in the essay competition organized by the WCC to mark the 50th anniversary. In their essays, these young theologians unpacked in their own very distinctive ways new models for interreligious engagement that are fresh in terms of their focus and futuristic in terms of their scope. So we thought that an appropriate way of commemorating an occasion like this would be to seek inspiration and challenge from their voices and visions. Therefore, let me welcome our first speaker, Ms. Leah Schlenker. Ms. Schlenker is a Lutheran theologian from Germany whose work focuses on intercultural theology and interreligious dialogue, especially Christian-Muslim dialogue. She developed her essay around the theme of hospitality in her work entitled From Shared Meals to Interreligious Conversation. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you for the introduction, Peniel, and greetings and blessings to all of you. Thank you very much for the opportunity today to share some thoughts from my essay on the future of interreligious dialogue. I have chosen the title From Shared Meals to Interreligious Conversations because I focus on the example of interreligious meals as a starting point for theological reflection. Overall, I observe that today's interreligious dialogue happens at 3 levels. First, at an academic level. Second, at a national and international level of churches and faith-based organizations. And third, at a local level among communities of different religious traditions. However, in my experience, these levels seldomly interrelate. For instance, While the notion of interreligious hospitality plays a key role in comparative theology at an academic level, the concrete practice of hospitality is rarely used as a resource for theological reflection. Given the richness of actual encounter among believers of different faith traditions, I find it essential that on the one hand, the practice of interreligious dialogue informs its reflection, and on the other hand, that theological reflections provide both a horizon and concrete impulses for interreligious practices. I will give some examples how a reflection of interreligious hospitality might contribute to a closer interrelations of the different levels of dialogue. One concrete practice of hospitality is the sharing of meals. Be it academic conferences, meetings of faith-based organizations, or encounters of religious communities on a local level, food and drink are almost always part of an encounter. This brings certain challenges, such as religious dietary restrictions, but it can also be a fruitful starting point for interreligious theological conversations. For instance, what does it mean for a Christian to say grace before a meal? Does it differ from a blessing which a Jew might offer? Regarding the food itself, does a Hindu who does not eat meat have similar reasons for it as a Muslim vegetarian? Also, somebody might bring a specific dish, be it for a religious holiday or be it linked to the international history of a person. Further, which religious stories inform our eating? What if a Christian tells her neighbor stories about Jesus and his meals, and a Muslim shares stories of the Prophet Muhammad and how he referred to God's bounty? Starting from observation of what one eats, where, when, how, and with whom, one can delve deeper into reflection what hospitality at the table means and how it relates to religious beliefs. A theology of creation at the table might evolve, or an interreligious exchange on ethics of consumption, or a conversation about how religion shapes everyday life, including meals. The future of interreligious dialogue is manifold, thanks to the many different people and initiatives involved in it. One way to develop interreligious dialogue could consist of religious institutions furthering the exchange between academic theologians and local parishioners by inviting them to the same table to share a meal and to reflect theologically about it. This could enrich the notions and practices of interreligious dialogue on all three levels and contribute to bridge the gaps between them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Leah, for your fascinating presentation. We will now move to hear from our next speaker, Mr. Krishno Sapteno. Mr. Sapteno is a member of the staff of the Research and Development Body of the Protestant Church in the Moluccas in Indonesia. He focuses on dialogue with indigenous spiritual traditions in his essay entitled Linguistic Hospitality, Welcoming Indigenous Religion into Interreligious Dialogue. Welcome, Krishno.
Okay, thank you, Peniel, for a wonderful introduction. I feel grateful to be one of the winners in this competition. On this occasion, I will share about my essay. In my point of view, world religions like Christian and Islam, for some reasons, are quite dominate many things about religions in Indonesia. However, this kind of domination also quite discriminative for those who have been defined as the religion, as the indigenous religion. This kind of discrimination can be seen in definition of religion in Indonesia. Based on the world religions paradigm, every religion needs to have some elements that are essentially similar with Christianity, such as doctrine, the Bible, and the faith in worship. This paradigm finally put only 6 religions that have been recognized by the government, like Islam, Christian, Catholicism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism. Then based on the one-sided definition of religion, the indigenous belief finally got excluded and have been placed as animism, dynamism, culture, mythicism, and belief group. So indigenous religion have seen as a different things and lower than religion. In my opinion, Discrimination against indigenous religions happen in Christian theology of religions. The theologians rarely talk about the relation between Christianity and indigenous religion. The approaches of theology of religions are stuck in the world religions paradigm. So it is difficult to include the indigenous religion into the theology of religion discourse. Indigenous people believe couldn't be a part of religion. Rather, categorization of religion is accepted by theologians as universal and neutral. So it is important to offer an approach in theology of religion, which is providing a space for the different religious phenomena. I see Moyart with her linguistic hospitality can be an alternative to inspire an interreligious dialogue between Christianity and indigenous religion. She's not talking about the world religions paradigm, but touches the main problem of the Christianity and indigenous religion. It is the close understanding about others and desire to define others in the Christianity terms. Moyart said that exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism, and particularism have the same tendencies. Hermeneutically, it is a close understanding for others. Inclusivism emphasizes discontinuity with other religions. Inclusivism points to continuity as long as other religions have the similarity with Christianity. Pluralism looks like accepting all the differences from the other religions, but still focus on the universal things and ignore the uniqueness of every religion's tradition. And particularism emphasizes about particular dimension in every religion and leads each religion being it the differences. Moyart uses Paul Ricoeur thought about translating as the inspiration of linguistic hospitality as a pattern of dialogue. According to Ricoeur, in the linguistic world, the perfect translation between two languages is impossible. There is a lost meaning in every translation process. Both translator and speaker need to keep doing the translation process, so hospitality is happening. Moyart argued that linguistic hospitality should be a model of interreligious encounters. Linguistic hospitality teaches to welcoming others in their otherness. Try to understand others without putting them into the Christianity. Hospitality between religions is an ongoing process, so we should realize that understanding other religions never be perfect. For me, Moyart offers an awareness of imperfect understanding and humility to make space for others. So Christianity never defined indigenous religions lower than world religions as animism, dynamism, mysticism, or beliefs group. I think it can be relevant for dialogue between indigenous religion and Christianity. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kritsno, for that interesting presentation. Our third essayist who was due to speak to us today was Ioannis Christodoulakis from the Greek Orthodox Church. Unfortunately, he is not feeling well and therefore is not able to be with us online. Rather, he has sent a video of his presentation, which I now request our communication colleagues to share with us.
I would like to express my deep gratitude to the committee that has chosen my text and many others in this competition. I would also like to express my warm congratulations to all the participants who made their try and showed their interest about the aspects and the future of interreligious dialogue. On my behalf, I want to present you briefly my work. Orthodoxy by itself is a very rich and complex topic, which is hard to put in few words. This is why I choose the phrase of the Greek poet Georgios Eferis when he received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1963. I feel at this moment that I am a living contradiction. The rich heritage that the Orthodox Church carries for 2 millennia, apart from being the column of faith, tradition, and way of life for so many people, sometimes can be transformed into a vehicle of discomfort. It is useful to acknowledge that this flexibility regarding the interpretation of the monuments of the past can be proven hopeful, leading to a life in Christ, or harmful, leading to a life away from Him. To clarify my position, I believe that the Holy and Great Council, which took place in Crete in 2016, is without doubt the greatest and best coordinated step that the Orthodox Church didn't hesitate to make in our times. She addressed her intention to embrace the heart of the modern human, to listen to her pulse, and to reinterpret her position. This synodal reflection is primarily in favor of collectivism. Meanwhile, she is refuting the narcissistic religious individualism that leads to the necrosis of the body of the Church. The Church, as the body of Christ, includes in her womb the whole human existence, regardless of the gender, the nation, or the religion. The Church is a place where every human being can find a shelter and experience love. The principles of Orthodoxy are the respect of the human prosopon, the freedom of will, and the self-determination of the exousia. Taking into consideration the above theological claims, which are directly related to the ecclesiastic anthropology, the text of the Holy and Great Council elaborate to the interreligious perspectives. In front of the modern major global problems, such as the war conflicts, poverty, climate change, and others, religions need to build bridges of communication and peace, instead of widening this gap further. These commonly discussed formulations and statements must become a way of life, an ethos, an action, a daily habit. Last but not least, I wish that eventually the verbal statements escape the text and become actions and a better way of life. The Church, as the body of Christ and people, can cultivate with greater consistency these prospects. This work moves along the above theological lines, while it is structured in 3 parts. The first part outlines some milestones in the history of the interfaith dialogue in the tradition of the Orthodox Church. The second part devotes experts about the interreligious perspectives opened by the encyclical, the message, and the decision of the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church, and comments on them selectively. At the end, follow the conclusions, the critique, and the reflections for new ideas. The paper is entitled The Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church and its Interreligious Dialogue Approach, and that is why it focuses on this particular session. Thank you very much for your attention.
With deep gratitude to Ioannis, let us now move on to our next speaker, Ms. Nicole Carlson. Ms. Carlson is a recent graduate from the University of Utah with an undergraduate degree in international studies and a French minor. She is now a campus ministry intern with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. In her essay, Ms. Carlson explores dance as a form of interreligious dialogue. So over to you, Nicole.
Hello. I would like to begin by saying thank you to the World Council of Churches for providing this opportunity for young theologians like myself to share how we hope to pursue a future of interreligious dialogue. In our increasingly pluralistic world connected by media and technology, gathering with a mission to share differing perspectives is such a rich opportunity for dialectic growth. Now, understanding events like the one we're in right now, we're separated by distance, time zones, and screens. We are not physically together. Yet, even in physical conferences, there is a tendency of overformalization and a hyper-focus on theological differences. I find that by solely relying on a verbal medium for interreligious dialogue, it dehumanizes those who are not a part of our religion or culture. Now, regarding my research, I discuss how dance should be pursued as a medium of interreligious dialogue to supplement events like the one we are in right now. While the purpose is not to say that dance should be the only medium of communication, I argue that analyzing movement needs to be considered on a broader scale. In current literature on interreligious dialogue, Many scholars and theologians conclude that artistic dialogue facilitates cross-cultural interaction, yet their analysis stops there. So I try to bridge the gap between a generalized art and a specific art form by exploring how dance, by its very nature, is shaped by religious worldview. Now, dance is an intrinsically religious experience given its multidimensionality. Dance integrates how our values dictate our movement in relationship to time, space, others, ourselves, and even who we consider God. As we live out our lives, we experience everything through this body that we call our own. Therefore, it's imperative that we understand how our religions and worldviews shape our bodily perception, as that impacts every moment of our lives. Now, through my American non-denominational Christian lens, I argue that Christianity has a role to play in the pursuit of integrating faith and dance. Scripturally, we are called to embody our faith. From the beginning, Genesis 1:27 emphasizes that all of humanity carries the Imago Dei in our physicalized selves. Therefore, we must seek to understand how our bodies reflect characteristics of God. Additionally, God sends his son Jesus as a man to this earth, both fully God and fully human, reflecting the need of an embodied relationship. Now, lastly, the Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, calls Christians to true and proper worship through the offering of our bodies. There is a scriptural need for physicalized spiritual worship. So, this new perspective on worship can be applied to interreligious context, as by physicalizing our faith through dance, we're able to embody the humanity of those who were once considered different. My paper then explores how dance in Hinduism, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then in non-denominational Christianity interact with their faith traditions' relationship to dance. And I encourage you to read more about these specific traditions in my paper, this coming publication of Current Dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for reminding us about the embodied dimension of dialogue. Friends, our last panelist today is the Reverend Christopher West. Reverend West is a priest in the Church of Ireland, and he explores faith, hope, and love as key principles for interreligious engagement in his essay. Over to you, Christopher.
Thank you. And greetings from Ireland, and in particular from the people and clergy of the Church of Ireland, a province of the Anglican Communion, of these United Dioceses of Dublin and Glendalough, and of Tiny Parish, with whom I'm called to serve. This afternoon, I want to focus on a relevant exegetical strand, relevant because it underpins much of what I have to say in my essay in relation to hope, but also because it has import for our current conversation about interreligious engagement. Simply put, I want to suggest that a careful reading of the parable of the Good Samaritan, St. Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37 inclusive, identifies interreligious engagement not only as the grounds of Christian hope, but also as basic to the Christian way of being in the world today. In conventional readings of the parable, we tend to identify ourselves with the Good Samaritan, and this, of course, affirms us as gracious benefactors, those who have the will and the resources needed to lift other people out of the gutter. And note carefully the word "we" in that sentence, which sounds dangerously similar to the language of in-group and out-group dynamics C.S. Lewis, a child of the Church of Ireland, so often warns us about. Samuel Wells, a scholar priest in the Church of England, identifies several problems with this interpretation. To begin with, it misses the immediate textual context of the parable itself. Jesus uses it not simply in response to the question, "Who is my neighbour?" chapter 10, verse 29, but also in response to the issues raised by the earlier question, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" chapter 10, verse 25. In short, this parable, in some way or another, is about our salvation. But perhaps most significantly of all is that the conventional interpretation misinterprets our role in salvation history, and hence the logic of grace itself. We do not have the resources needed, or if we are really honest with ourselves, the will to save others or even ourselves, but God in Christ saves us anyway. Following this line of interpretation, Christ is the true Good Samaritan. The point being, our salvation comes from the very last person we might expect. Remember the prologue to St. John's Gospel. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. Chapter 1, verse 11. Christian hope in the context of interreligious engagement, then, is nothing less than the realization that the other person has the potential to save us, not least from our preoccupation with ourselves and from our sense of self-sufficiency. That is to say, interreligious engagement is not only creedal and entirely orthodox, but also vital to the Christian life. To be a Christian in the world today, we not only have to be aware of the interreligious, but actively engaged in the interreligious. Our salvation, as it were, depends upon it. And this is how we are to begin reflecting on questions of what should constitute our approach to interreligious engagement. We are not the Good Samaritan, the gracious benefactor, but the person by the side of the road, stripped, wounded, and dependent upon the other person for our very lives. In short, we're the needy ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher, for your presentation. Friends, having heard from our 5 speakers, without further delay, I want us to move on to the intergenerational conversation. And to lead this aspect of our session today, let me invite Dr. Are Raja and Dr. Clay Amos to lead us.
Thank you, Peniel. First of all, can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I want to express my deep appreciation for the 5 presentations. If any one of us had anxieties about the future of interfaith dialogue, the 5 people have given us enormous hope as to the future of interfaith dialogue, both by their very articulated analysis of the situation and by creative and new ways of thinking about where we need to move. Therefore, I want to first of all say that I'm very pleased as one of the older generation people in this job. I'm very, very pleased with this afternoon's what we have been having here of a very hopeful future for interfaith dialogue. So actually, I have not asked, I do not want to ask questions from the 2 people whom I am going to begin conversation with, but and I am also 100% agree with you that hospitality can be a very, very strong basis for interfaith dialogue.
Wesley, I just want to interrupt you. We lost you for a moment. We lost you for a few moments earlier. So if you want to go back and then remind us of what we lost.
Okay. Most of the first part was an appreciation for the papers that are presented and the hope that we have in the younger generation for the future of the interfaith dialogue. Now, specifically turning to Leah, I wanted to affirm the idea of hospitality as a foundational way in which we can think about interfaith dialogue. In fact, there have been much already thinking about hospitality. In fact, we had a major consultation in the dialogue subunit on the question of hospitality as an entry point for interfaith dialogue. Therefore, I want to affirm whatever you said. And I'm especially happy that you are interested in bringing the academic as well as the leadership at the second level of religious people and church people, and then the community. And you are also suggesting that when the communities come together in a hospital to eat together, that we bring the academicians so that they can also feel how this dialogue can be felt at the local level and promoted. I wanted to raise a question that some people have raised when we talked about this hospitality. How far can the concept of hospitality take us when we come across a more serious engagement on issues that divide us, issues over which people have non-negotiable beliefs, or people who feel that because of our faith, because of our own faith, we cannot really engage the others except beyond hospitality in a much more creative theological dialogue, etc. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about can hospitality help us also, or how it can help us also to deal with some of the very divisive areas of relationship. For example, between Jews and Muslims, Jews and Christians, Muslims and Christians, and there has been a long history of inability to move to crucial questions, but to keep the relationship at the superficial level. How will you answer somebody says the hospitality entry point is rather superficial? I don't think so. But if they say, how can it lead to much greater engagement on matters that divide us?
Leah, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Professor Ariarachi, for this wonderful question. I think actually this is why I emphasize the importance of practice and of reflecting the practice, because I believe that our modes of hospitality that we know from our childhood, from what we have learned in our upbringing, they already reflect on how to deal with the other. How to deal if I eat, for example, with somebody who behaves differently at the table than I do, or maybe prefers rather not to sit at the table at all. So I think there are so many practices already ingrained in our bodies, and this is also maybe a link to Nicole's presentation. There's so many modes of dealing with difference already in our modes of existence and of behaving, that this can actually lead us also to, maybe as a guide, to deal with those areas where we don't feel comfortable. In my essay, in the full version, I gave an example from my experiences that I had in Oman, where we had wonderful Muslim tutors and we had wonderful experiences together and reflections, but we had really a lot of problems tackling theological issues, especially the doctrine of incarnation and stuff like that, like these issues that you mentioned that are somehow difficult. And like looking back at these experiences, I wondered maybe we would have done better in our theological dialogue if we had started from our practice, reflecting on our practice and then leading up to these difficult questions. Because I believe we can only tackle the difficult questions if we already develop a sense of friendship and a sense of how do we deal with difference in this particular group. Because interreligious dialogue never happens between the religions. It's between the particular people sitting together and finding a mode of how to converse. So maybe, these are some thoughts on your question.
Thank you. It is a very helpful answer, because through the hospitality, we develop trust with each other and be able to understand each other. Then it opens much easier for us to tackle the more difficult questions. Thank you. So shall I move on to the second presentation? The second presentation is something that really challenged me. And this is something that I had to struggle with when I was a director of the Interfaith Dialogue Program about the whole question of indigenous religious traditions. And I think Krishna put his finger at the right place when he says the difficulty that we have is that the so-called world religions like Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, etc., are so well defined and are so rooted in doctrines, so rooted in history, so rooted in verbal ways of talking about and rational ways of talking about the faith. They have lost something very primary and important as human beings in order to come to grip with the realities of life. We had a very poor record even in the World Council of Churches, of respecting and dealing and relating to indigenous religious traditions. We had a number of attempts to have dialogue with other indigenous religious traditions, and they have also included indigenous religious people in multilateral dialogues. But none of them were able to really come to grip with the very important question that Krishna has raised for us. Now, the problem is that the world religions, so-called scriptural religions or doctrinal religions, and the religions of indigenous people are so different in structure that they are unable to get together. Therefore, some people have suggested that it is not the religion that we should talk about, but spirituality as a center of Christian interfaith relations. Because all the religious traditions are finally trying to make us spiritual beings, people who are sensitive to ourselves, to God, and to our neighbors. So I want to ask Katsuno whether one of the ways that we can move in interfaith dialogue in the future is to place not so much emphasis on religions, but on spirituality. And spirituality becomes a basis for our engagement with each other. What is would be a response to you from that?
Okay, Wesley, thank you for the question. I think we must realize there's something wrong with our definition and categorization about religions, because the definition we hold to do make Christianity as a prototype of the religion. So to be a religion, we have to have the similarity with Christianity. So I think everything have similarity with Christianity will be defined as the religion, and which have no similar element with Christianity is not a religion. So they are defined as the false religion about animism, about dynamism, or just about the spiritual tradition. I think this world religions paradigm we hold today is something problem with that. So I think we have to rethinking again about our interreligious dialogue, because I think the interreligious dialogue today is just exclusive between the world religions paradigm, like Islam and Christians, or the Christians with the Hinduism, but now never Christian with the indigenous religion. So I think we discriminating other religions, phenomena like indigenous religions, about because of our definition of about religion. Thank you. Sorry for that.
Thank you. Because it becomes a particularly difficult question when we come to indigenous Christians. Then the question is, it's more of an internal dialogue within one's own life about how to relate to their faith, what they receive from. But I am very much attracted by your criticism of Christianity as a dominating religion, and more or less setting up the marks of religion. You know, the scripture and the founder and doctrines and institutions, etc. And expecting other religions, everybody else to have such a, that colonialist understanding of religion has been the major problem that we had in relating to indigenous people. Therefore, we have to ask whether Christians are a spiritual tradition coming out of the teachings of Jesus. Are Christians, the Muslims, a religious tradition that is living out this revelation that Prophet Muhammad has given. So should we rethink our own religious traditions in more spiritual ways is what I was asking. But I am very pleased with the way that you have responded. All that I can say, this matter is a very important question. It has been not been properly dealt with, and in the future we have to deal with this question very, very seriously.
You want to come in, Claire?
Thank you. I think probably it's now my chance to say thank you to all the young SS. I enjoyed all the presentations. And I've got a question for Nicole. Your beautiful reflection on dance reminded me of a lovely Christian song by the hymn writer Reverend, which goes like this: a dancer's body leaps and falls, and as the move succeeds or fails, she cannot hide behind her pride, but openly herself reveals. And what I think Reverend is trying to say in this song and in these words is that in dance, in a very special way, our human vulnerabilities cannot be concealed. And I have a sense, a sort of inkling, that this is saying something important to us about interreligious engagement, that in this area too, that we need to allow our vulnerabilities and weakness to be displayed in ways that we are often afraid to do. And I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say to us about this, Nicole.
Okay, so I'm going to share a bit from my personal testimony of like how dance and faith has been intertwined for me. Through my teenage years, I was actually on the track to studying to become a professional ballet dancer. And a lot of that is so focused on control and being very, very precise about movements, but also expressing artistry. But for all this time, what inhibited my personal movement was that need of control. I actually was a very stiff dancer, and I needed to step away from that because not just in dance, but in my life, I would try to control every aspect of what was going on. And this automatically reminds me of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6, verse 25. I'm reading from the NIV translation. Therefore, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is life not more than food, and the body more than clothes? Growing up trying to become a professional ballet dancer, my worldview, while I said I was a Christian, I did not reflect that inherent need of putting all of my anxieties and casting them into Christ. So now transitioning into campus ministry, where I'm fully trying to embody what God calls us into as Christians, I'm now seeing that I can dance more freely. And that does create a vulnerability that I'm not used to. And in an interreligious context, that is so needed, because we can't be putting on this facade of control when we're trying to interact with other people. We need to be showing our real inside and our humanity. Because are we really interacting with other people of other religions if we're just pretending like we believe X, Y, and Z? Or are we actually living out in our body, embodying our faiths? And are we exploring what it means to truly be a Christian, or to truly be a Hindu, to truly be a Muslim, to et cetera, et cetera? So I think that vulnerability is extremely important and hard. And I've seen that in my own personal life, and I see it in other people, and I hope to see it continue into the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicole. I'm sorry that Ioannis can't be with us because he's not so well. If he had been here, there was a comment that he had made in his essay that I was going to ask him to explore. He was quoting Archbishop Anastasios of Albania, who is somebody that I've privileged to encounter and meet through the World Council of Churches. And it is a real privilege to have met Archbishop Anastasios, that egocentrism is the great heresy. I thought that was a fascinating comment. And the Archbishop went on to say that it's that as a basic condition of dialogue, religions need to enter into a very serious, honest self-criticism. I think that's interesting. I mean, I think it's all part of the theme of vulnerability, and Christopher's going to get a question from me in a moment that's got an aspect about vulnerability in it. And I certainly think that interreligious dialogue is an area where, to honestly and properly engage with it, we need to be willing to make ourselves vulnerable. So I just wanted to allude to these comments by Johannes, because I think they're saying something important to us about honest self-criticism, and express again my regret that that because of the current situation of COVID, he can't be with us. So on to Christopher, and I have a question for you. And I apologize actually, because it's not in fact the question that I was intending to originally ask you, because you struck me so strongly in something you said. And you were talking about how we all identified with the Good Samaritan. You know, if we were reading the parable of the Good Samaritan, we thought of ourselves as the Good Samaritan. Well, I remember a really interesting reflection by a Western academic. It was actually somebody called John Drain, you may have heard of him, from Scotland, who went on a visit to the Philippines and who was participating in a group of a Bible study group that was being led by a local person in a fairly marginal community in the Philippines. And that question was asked, you know, who do you identify with in the story? And of course, John Drain sat there and thought, oh, Good Samaritan, I think I'm not the priest, I'm not the Levite, I'm the Good Samaritan. And the people that everybody else in that room identified with the man who'd fallen among thieves. And I think that for Drain, as he reflected on it, that says something profoundly important in terms of where we're coming from and how we see things. And so I suppose the question I have to you, Christopher, is along the lines of what difference does it make our own context to how we engage in things interreligiously, and perhaps do people in places like the Philippines, where life is perhaps rather more vulnerable than it is in Ireland or Scotland or where I am at the moment in England, do they have something really important to offer the future of interreligious dialogue that those of us in the United Kingdom and Ireland have to listen to?
Thank you. Well, a number of things struck me as you were speaking. The first was a quotation from a Jewish Catholic philosopher. Her name has just escaped me, who has written a rather lovely but very challenging essay about empathy. And she notes in it that we can't see the back of our own heads. And by that, she means that which of us can truly say we know even ourselves? And we need perhaps what we deem to be the other to look at the back of our heads and to reflect that back to us. And I think that's especially true of our approach, as I did there a few moments ago, to the biblical text. I suppose we need to do a kind of self-inventory, asking what we're bringing to this text. But that's true, I think, of all of our conversations in terms of interreligious encounter and engagement. And often, as I say, we don't quite have the level of self-awareness needed to see those things about ourselves. What struck me as you were speaking was that it was very much my own temptation to read myself into the parable as the Good Samaritan. And I can't help but wonder whether that's perhaps an especially strong temptation for the clergy and for those in caring professions. in some ways, the kind of dominant theme in a lot of training for any kind of ministry and mission can sometimes run the risk of sounding rather a lot like a competition for souls. And I wonder that if it's a particular temptation for us who see that we have something perhaps to offer and to look with compassion on someone who is in the gutter, as it were, to see ourselves into to read ourselves into the Good Samaritan figure. And that's where we really need those others to come in and say, actually, here's where I identify, and perhaps this says something more profoundly about you and about your reading of the parable than it does about the parable itself.
Thank you. Thank you very much. How are we doing for time, Peniel?
I'm just keeping an eye on the question and answers function. And there are a few questions from the audience. Unless you Wesley, want to ask one question for all the panelists that they might have about 30 seconds to answer, Claire. And then we move on to take questions from the floor, if that works.
I think probably I'm happy to let, from my side, the questions to come from the floor now.
Okay, good. What about you, Wesley? Are you okay with that? Yeah. We've got okay. If both of you are okay with that, and the panelists, the young panelists, are okay with that too. I see a few questions in the Q&A section. The first one is whether religion itself is a human participation in the eternal dance of God that creates and sustains life. Is religion itself a human participation in the eternal dance of God that creates and sustains life?
So I feel like that really relates to my presentation and my essay. So in the early church, there was this word to talk about the interrelation of the Trinity, which is perichoresis. It's roughly used as dance at times. That's not exactly what it means, but it talks about how within the Trinity, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, they act and interact and move within one another to be one unified being. And I really view us as humans like dance in a very broad term. It's how you react and interact in situations. So I would definitely agree where religion is as a very broad term, can also be reflected in a very broad interpretation of the term dance as a action and interaction within our lives. And it's shaped by the people we're surrounded with. It's shaped by the access to resources that we have. It's shaped by how we're socialized growing up. One really cool thing about movement that I've noticed is that cultures from around the world have different movements that are socialized into them, not only with body language, but how different cultures' dances are used. There are different emphasis on whether or not you're very grounded or you feel very close to the earth, or you try to, in fact, to dominate or move past gravitational boundaries, stuff like that.
Thank you.
So yes, I could go on about this. Read it in my essay.
Thank you, Nicole. I think that was helpful. The other question that I have is to what extent the WCC's Interreligious dialogue program has a post-colonial appreciation or a post-colonial facilitation of God's justice and care in every place and for all people. This looks more like a question for Wesley and Claire, but if any of the panelists want to respond to that too, you're most welcome. You wanted Wesley, you're muted.
Read the question again.
How can we reimagine interfaith engagement as a post-colonial facilitation of God's justice and care in every place and for all people?
It's a very, very good question. All that I can say is that there had not been a conscious attempt to see the interfaith dialogue as a vehicle for a postcolonial understanding of God's care for all of creation. But you must realize that the Interfaith Dialogue Program is only one aspect of the work of the World Council of Churches. And if you take the whole work of the World Council of Churches as a whole, then one can say that it has been an outstanding manifestation of how a religious tradition can have a self-understanding that really expresses itself in the form of caring for the needy, for standing for justice, championing the cause of women and children. Almost in every area of justice, the World Council of Churches have been. So the dialogue subunit is part of that whole program. And I would say that what the question might challenge us in the future is that how the dialogue program also can become more consciously part of this post-colonial understanding of how religion should be a vehicle for justice and peace for all people everywhere.
Thank you very much for that, Wesley. There is one more question which asks about the relevance of interreligious dialogue and cooperation in the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think that might be a good one for the panelists to take off the cuff. Who's going to go first? Yes, Christopher.
Well, very briefly, I think the pandemic has made us all both more local and more global at once. In some ways, it's as easy to encounter and to discuss something with someone who's overseas as it is to encounter someone who's down the road from us. So there are opportunities for greater engagement as a result of the digital context. But there are also challenges, and that comes from the local side. There are certain things which are difficult to say to people when you are kind of one-on-one, almost adversarial on Zoom. That would be much easier to talk about when you're in person and embodied and together in the one space and time. So I would say both challenges and opportunities for interfaith engagement in pandemic times.
Thank you, Christopher. And the other question that I have relates to the theme of hospitality. It says suspicion and fear of the other seem to be a real challenge and a lived reality. How can we help persons to move from a place of hostility to hospitality? Do you want to take that, Leah?
Yes, sure. Thank you for the question. I think maybe it relates a little bit to our COVID situation as well, because we really lack real encounter, right? And I think fear and misunderstanding can only be overcome by real encounter. And as Christopher has just pointed out, sometimes in these, even though it's wonderful to be gathered here online all together, it is not the ideal medium to really overcome differences. So I think we are sharply reminded how important human encounter is and how important it is that organizations such as the WCC are able to facilitate these encounters on the one hand. And on the other hand, I think hospitality is also a great way of, at least if we use it for theological reflection, of understanding ourselves. I mean, that relates to a lot of that has been said already, but I think essentially, at least in my Western European academic context, there's a huge lack of religious literacy. And I think this is also related to the fact that we don't understand our religious everyday life anymore, that we don't understand the religious implications in it. So I think if we relearn to reflect on our lives, because COVID has shown so drastically how within a day, basically, our entire life can change, and how important it is that we are actually able to reflect on this and that we have tools for this. So I think these are areas where interreligious dialogue is crucial.
Thank you, Leah. I think this one is for Krishno, and it is a question about how we deal with the situation of indigenous traditions and Christian engagements, where the traditions and customs about living are influenced by traditions. Oops. That question disappeared. Okay. It is about how do we live with. One second. Let me find it. Yes. Yeah. About. How do we deal with the situation of indigenous traditions and Christian engagements where the traditions about living are influenced by traditions which have their foundations within traditional religions? And this is from the context of African traditional religions. So do you want to take that, Krishno? Effectively, what is being asked is, how do we reconcile indigenous traditions and Christian engagements in context where people live between and within these two traditions?
Okay, Peniel, thank you for the question. I don't know about the African context, but I think for the future of interreligious dialogue, we have to accept the different religious phenomena like indigenous religion. Because sometimes indigenous people living together with us or living around us, but it seems like they are not exist because their beliefs are not recognized as a religion. So we might feel that we are open or inclusive for our interreligious dialogue, but they still exclude from our interreligious dialogue. So I think the dialogue between indigenous religion and Christianization in Christianity is a first step for the indigenous religion's recognition in our context in Indonesia, because our interreligious dialogue with indigenous religion sometimes can be a liberative for us. I mean, set us free from the tendencies to define others. Religious like indigenous religion, maybe in Indonesia or maybe in Africa, and also can be liberative for them also. So set them free from the discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me wrap this session by asking each one of you to spell out one word that you think defines the future of interreligious dialogue. Is there one word that comes to mind that for you captures the future of interreligious dialogue? Who do you start with? Wesley, Claire, Leah, Christopher, Krishna, or Nicole?
My word would be vulnerability.
Thank you, Claire.
Hope.
Thank you, Wesley.
Encounter.
Encounter. Thanks, Leah.
Liberative.
Krishna, I didn't get that. Sorry.
Liberative.
Liberative. Thanks. Thank you very much, Krishna.
I would have to say honesty.
Thanks, Nicole. Honesty. Christopher.
I'm going to say vital.
Thank you very much. I think in some way that brings us to the end of a fascinating conversation. And thank you so very much for the generous spirit and the spirit of hospitality with which you engaged each other. Thanks to all our 7 speakers. From this point, we move on to another celebratory moment today, which is the launching of our 50th anniversary publication. This publication is entitled Faith Seeking Justice, Dialogue and Liberation, and we are really glad that our Acting General Secretary, Father Jon Soka, will be launching this today. But before I pass the floor on to Professor Soka, I want to gratefully acknowledge the presence of a few of the contributors to the volume who are present with us today in this event. We have Professor Hyalans Hu from the University of Detroit, Professor Ananthanand Rambachan from St. Olaf College, Philadelphia, Dr. Naila Tabara from the Adyan Foundation, Dr. Meera Baindur from Manipal University, Dr. Rahul Jondale from Geetam University, Hyderabad, and Dr. Eve Rebecca Parker from Durham, and of course, Dr. Wesley Arya Raja, who is also one of the contributors. We are all grateful for your presence here today and your contribution to the volume. So now over to Father Sauka to release this publication.
Thank you so much, Peniel. But before I go there, I say something which I don't have written. Comes from my heart. Sincere thanks and congratulations to all participants. For me, it was very refreshing to listen to you, linking the past with the perspective to the future. I see great hope as we move to the future. It's not denying our identity as Christians, but moving together on the way. Our ecumenical paradigms in Busan was pilgrimage of justice and peace, meaning walking together with others Christians, non-Christians, or people of no faith, but who share the same spiritual values. So listening to you, I have great hope that we can move together on our common convictions, common spiritual values to witness together to the world. Now, saying that, I would like now to go to the launch of the book. And it is my joy on this occasion to launch the book, Faiths Seeking Justice, Dialogue and Liberation. Published by the WCC to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the WCC program on interreligious dialogue, the book seeks to reimagine interreligious dialogue as a dialogue of and for life. With deep gratitude to the various contributors to this volume, I launch this book today. May this book be a tool in our common search for justice, peace, and the flourishing of life through interreligious cooperation.
Thank you very much, Father Jons, for launching this book. To say the formal word of thanks from the Interreligious Dialogue team, let me invite my colleague, the Reverend Dr. David Marshall, who will offer closing words of gratitude. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Peniel. Thank you, Peniel, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity to say a few words at the conclusion of this very significant and very hopeful event marking the 50th anniversary of the World Council of Churches opening of an office for work in interreligious relations. Along with Peniel, I'm very grateful to our Acting General Secretary, the Reverend Professor Dr. Johan Sauka, for joining us today. Thank you, Father Sauka, for your encouraging comments on the importance of interreligious dialogue and cooperation within the wider work of the WCC. And Peniel and I are also deeply grateful for the very committed way in which, in your time as Acting General Secretary, you have worked untiringly with us and other colleagues on a variety of interreligious relationships and projects. Thank you very much. Many thanks also to Professor Wesley Araya Raja and to Dr. Claire Amos for joining us. We're very glad to have been able to hear your reflections on interreligious work at the WCC in the past, based on your many years of distinguished service here. And thank you also for engaging so encouragingly and perceptively with the work of our 5 essay prize winners and asking such good questions. Your thoughtful comments prompted a very worthwhile conversation. And that brings me to our prize winners. And let me mention here that the question has been asked in chat, I think, a few times. Yes, their essays will be printed in full in the next edition of Current Dialogue. I believe that's correct. Is that right, Peniel? Yes, I'm sure that's right. So many thanks indeed to each of you, to Leah, Christno, Ioannis in absentia. Get well soon, Ioannis, Nicole, and Christopher. It was a pleasure to read your essays and a joy to meet you all, excuse me, to meet you all online today. Every blessing to you and keep up the good work. Now, it's not very good to do, it's not very easy to do a round of applause on these occasions, but I'm going to lead us in a round of applause, and anyone who can join us. Well done. Thank you very much. And just a couple more things, really. Thanks are also due to all our colleagues in the WCC communications team for making this event happen very smoothly. Thank you to all of you. I also want to say something about our network of interreligious advisors. One of the gains for our team's work that has come out of all the difficulties in recent months is that we've seen significant growth in our network of interreligious advisors, many of whom have joined us today. Over recent months, we've met several times. The circle has grown, and we're learning more about each other's situations, contexts of interreligious relations in many different situations around the world. Many thanks to all of you who have joined us today, and may this network continue to grow and flourish. But there have been so many others who've joined us today for this event. Thank you to everyone, wherever you are in the world and in whatever time zone. We just saw Prince in New Zealand. It's 2:30 a.m. there. Thank you, wherever you are, whatever time zone, for making the time to be with us and to share in this conversation. One final word of thanks, which is for my friend and colleague, Peniel. Firstly, for arranging and chairing this splendid occasion. But another bigger word of thanks to Peniel is also called for today. It falls to me to observe that this must be either the last, or I think nearly the last, major event of this kind in which you will be involved, Peniel, before you leave the staff of the WCC after a long, extraordinarily active and very fruitful term of service here. So how appropriate this event at the end of your time here marks 50 years of WCC work in interreligious relations. And Peniel, you have indeed made a very major contribution to that 50-year history. And it's fitting that this occasion has both looked back at the past, but also has been an opportunity to look forward and to encourage others around the member churches of the WCC to become involved in this work. We're all deeply grateful, Peniel, for what you've done here. And as you leave for new tasks in the UK with the USPG, you go with our very best wishes and with our prayers. Thank you for everything, Peniel.
Thank you, David. That was a surprise.
Well, there we go. And unless there's anything else to be said from Peniel, that I think brings this program to a close. Thank you again to everyone for joining us.